I was recently thinking out loud, online, about the idea of a subway system for Melbourne, and I realized in my discussions that it's not always entirely clear what subways can do that regular trains cannot. Subways, or metros as I'll sometimes call them in this video, are trains. Sometimes they run below ground, and sometimes they run in decidedly train-like environments. And that does beg the question, in a world where trains are increasingly electric and often run in city center tunnels, is there really a reason for new subway networks to be built? Do they actually offer something that other transit modes cannot? And are cities without subway networks missing out by not building them? Let's discuss. Before we discuss whether metros are relevant in a world of EMUs on main lines and cross-city tunnels, it's valuable to actually separate metros from mainline suburban trains. For one, subway corridors look different, and they're typically heavily grade separated, meaning that you don't have crossings with vehicles or with pedestrians. And tracks are often elevated on guideways or are underground in city centers. Now, of course, this is often true with suburban rail systems, but as you exit the city center, it's common for suburban rail systems to have level crossings. That's not to say that grade-separated suburban rail doesn't exist. For example, the Copenhagen S-Tog network is entirely grade-separated, but it's also almost entirely above ground, whereas subway systems are often entirely below ground, or sometimes heavily elevated, which you really don't see for entire suburban rail lines. Now, being able to weave around underground obstacles, as well as being able to go from underground to above ground in a short span, is really important. Not to mention being able to quickly stop and accelerate out of a lot of stations. And for this reason, subway trains tend to have a very high power-to-weight ratio, which is often achieved by having low weight. Subway trains tend to be bare bones, they tend to not have a ton of amenities, and they usually can't handle things like a crash with a heavier mainline train because they typically are isolated. Since subway networks don't tend to have level crossings, unless you're Chicago or a couple others, you also tend to see third rail used quite widely. This can actually help you shrink the size of tunnels, which can make them less expensive, but it also limits your top speed. The trains are also often quite different. Since subways are so often under the ground, I mean it's quite literally in the name, you tend to see smaller trains. And that's because the size of an underground station is heavily dependent on how large it has to be, and how large it has to be is heavily dependent on how big the train is. That means that subway trains tend to be shorter and narrower than mainline trains in the same city. While it's really common to see suburban trains that extend over 200 meters long and have 8 or even more cars, this is less common on subways, and the average length of a subway train is probably in the 100 to 150 meter range. Of course, these smaller trains also tend to be lighter and have shorter individual cars. This helps maneuverability, flexibility, and acceleration, which are really important when you're inserting lines into an existing urban context. Now, despite being smaller, subway trains often have more doors than suburban ones, with 4 doors per side being quite common even on smaller subway cars. More doors is critical when you're running a high frequency of service and you can't be waiting for long in every single station. Having more doors is also useful when you have a lot of people getting on and off at every single station. Subways tend to be in more urban areas where more trips like that are happening, as opposed to the suburban-urban divide that you often see with mainline rail. There are also still distinctions between a metro-like suburban train, like the S-Bahn trains in Munich, and a regular metro train. In Munich, the S-Bahn trains can be split, and they're commonly split, even in service sometimes, something which is very uncommon for subway systems. You also have a lot of transverse seating on them, which is seats facing forward and backwards, and less doors than a typical subway, because most of the route is in suburban areas and operates at a lower frequency. And since some people will be riding for a long time, they want the forward-facing seats. If you're enjoying this video, I really recommend checking out my Substack down below. I did a series a couple of months ago about the difference between cities without regional rail and without metro systems, and I think you'd enjoy it. These distinctions between the way trains and routes are designed on subway systems has huge implications for the service provided and the network topologies that you actually see. Subways tend to have far less branching, where lines split, and interlining, where multiple lines run together, than you see on suburban rail. And that's because things like city center tunnels for suburban trains tend to be in short supply, and their high cost means they have to be used heavily to make sense. I did a whole video on how the different types of infrastructure shape suburban rail networks, so you can check that out up here. Since subways use those smaller and more flexible trains, there's a lower cost to entry for underground stations and tracks. And so you tend to see far more subway tunnel mileage than suburban rail city center tunnel mileage in most cities. But these tunnels still do need to justify their cost, and that means that you tend to not see a lot of branching, because branching, especially underground, would mean less efficient use of that expensive infrastructure. Just like how I mentioned with suburban trains that the infrastructure shapes the network design, the same is true of subways. Since subway lines are often entirely tunneled, it's actually the outer areas of the lines rather than the city center that's making the determination about branching. When you have a tunnel that goes to the edge of the dense urban core, you want to use it for as much service as possible. And that usually means running a single service along an entire subway line rather than having many tunnels feed into a city center one, and thus having all of those tunnels be less heavily used. Now, before you say, well, what about London? The reality is that London was an early metro system, and so they were kind of throwing stuff at the wall to see what would stick. Newer lines on the London Underground have less branching. And while yes, there are still networks that are heavily branched, like Oslo's metro for example, they are the exception rather than the norm. You can learn more about Oslo up here, but it was essentially a tram system that was converted into a metro, so it's quite unique. Because trains tend to be smaller and infrastructure tends to be expensive, you usually see subways operating a very high frequency of service to, again, justify their cost, as well as to just move a lot of people. Remember, the basic equation for capacity of a transit system is capacity equals size of vehicle times number of times it comes per hour. But this high frequency isn't just about capacity. It has huge implications for the entire network layout. When services are running every couple of minutes like they do on most subway and metro networks, you stop needing to serve every single destination with every line, because people can easily transfer from line to line to go from one place to another. This means that while it's very common to see a very hub and spoke style network for suburban trains, you see a lot more grid and mesh style networks for metro systems. And these fundamental layouts tend to self-reinforce. With a metro system, adding capacity often means adding another parallel line that strengthens the grid. Whereas with suburban trains, you're often adding more city center capacity that further cements the city center importance. Metro systems also tend to put more emphasis on good transfers, because more people are going to have a transfer as part of their journey. Fortunately, with trains that can navigate steep grades and tight turns, there's more potential for things like cross-platform interchanges. It's actually sometimes a little surprising to people who mostly ride, say, a commuter or suburban train on a regular basis, but it's entirely normal for people who use a subway system to commute to have to make a transfer or even two transfers in every single commute, and usually it's not such a big deal. All of this leads to different station spacings and travel patterns than you tend to see on mainline rail networks. For metro trains, which tend to have low top speeds but high acceleration, making lots of stops makes sense, even if stations are just a few hundred meters apart. And while it's common to see suburban trains extending 20 or 30 or even more kilometers outside of the city, this is really uncommon on metros, which again makes sense when they can't go all that fast. The reason that metro systems tend to be fairly compact and why metro systems don't extend so far from the city center is they stop being a competitive travel option because they can't compete with other modes. But the reality is that, like with so many elements of subway systems, the type of service and the network topology shapes the infrastructure and trains. And so part of the reason that subway trains are so basic is that most people aren't riding them for over an hour. So you don't necessarily need bathrooms and large plush transverse seats, stuff like that. And you can see how these patterns play out in the networks from Munich to Madrid. And yes, while there are always exceptions, metros are uniquely suited to a certain network design and service type. Namely short, high-frequency lines that are heavily interconnected. So why does any of this matter? Well, a big theme of the channel is that different transit infrastructure leads to different transit service, outcomes, and even land use. Cities that heavily depend on suburban rail are going to be more sprawling, and they're going to have a type of density that peters out as the service does. Whereas cities that are heavily dependent on metro are going to be able to develop in a more compact way, with more inner city coverage and development intensity that kind of drops off at the edge of the metro system. Metro systems also allow for types of trips that aren't practical at the same city size on other forms of transit, like medium distance point-to-point journeys that are fast, thanks to a grid of stations and high frequency. They also tend to allow for more complex infrastructure because of their lighter, more permissive rolling stock, but also they can be built to more standard standards because they tend to be greenfield and isolated from mainline networks. And as cities from Spain to Denmark and Japan show, you can even have small metro trains embedded within cities that have much larger suburban trains, since these small metro trains can make up for their small size by running at very high frequency. And as new technologies like automation and precast concrete guideways have become available, even smaller cities like Rennes have been able to get in on having metro networks, despite not being the size of a London or even a Seattle. Subways provide something different from other transit modes, and those differences are valuable and worth discussing. Thanks for watching.